Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first in a series where I get to duke it out with a guest over recordings of our favorite symphony. We're gonna. This is the first in our in 3 weeks, and tonight's guest is none other than conductor Martin MacDonald. Martin, welcome here.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here, or I'll here
Well,
virtually.
that's just it. We usually on Tuesdays and Thursdays have a meet the musicians in your neighborhood, and now we've
Mhm.
just expanded the neighborhood a little bit
Yeah,
to
yes,
include
indeed.
where are you calling from? Where are you
Uh,
zooming in from?
for my home in Toronto.
In Toronto.
Yeah.
And before we get it into the good old duke it out phase,
Mhm.
tell us a bit about yourself. Where are you from originally, and your musical background, that sort of thing.
I'm originally from Cape Breton, Nova Scotia. That's where I was born and raised. But I have been, as a good conductor does, I've lived in a lot of different cities. So I spent a lot of time after my degrees, some time in Hamilton and some time in Halifax. And now I've been in Toronto now for about 8 years.
8 years, okay. And you
Yeah.
do a lot of guest conducting all over the country, all over everywhere. Tell us a bit about that.
I've been doing a fair bit. I was resident conductor at Symphony, Nova Scotia, and then their associate conductor for a number of seasons. And I think I've conducted them for 13 seasons now. And I've pretty much covered every orchestra from coast to coast, except for Saskatoon
Aha,
for the next season.
that's right. Which brings us to the point. So
Right.
these 3 weeks that we were doing with this face off is with
Yes.
three guest conductors who will be joining us next season,
Great.
and
Yeah.
we're delighted to have you come
Yeah.
visit our fair city,
Hmm.
and to work with our great musicians. And so you've spent a lot of time in your home province, which is wonderful. And like you
Yes.
say, now you live in Toronto, so you can. It's a good gateway to conduct
Yeah.
everywhere.
It's a great base, and my wife has a wonderful job here in Toronto, and we have a beautiful, almost 5-year-old daughter, Frances.
Oh,
Uh,
nice.
so we've, it's been a good run for us here in Toronto for sure.
And you post sometimes pictures of your daughter and your wife, and your daughter is the
Oh,
cutest thing. Yeah.
looks like her mother. It's fine.
Nice. Now,
Yeah.
also for these 3 weeks, we've chosen three of Beethoven's most famous symphonies of his nine, and
Mhm.
this week we get to start with Beethoven Five. Beethoven Five is probably the most recognizable in terms of the general population. They know those first four notes, and they
Mhm.
might not know a lot of the rest of the symphony, but they certainly have heard it somewhere before. And so tonight, um, I'm just gonna bring up something. Here we go, a face-off between Martin MacDonald and Eric Paetkau. Good. So Martin, let's kick it off.
All right.
Tell us a bit about one or two or maybe even three favorite recordings.
Well, I do have three favorite recordings, and one of them probably edges out the other two if I had to really sort of rank them. Um, and that would be Roger Norrington and London Classical Players from the late 80s, early 90s. It was re released again in the early 2000s. But as I was saying to you before, I remember the day I bought the box set almost 20 years ago when I was in London.
Mm-hmm.
It is here.
Nice.
And I had just lost my audition to the Royal Academy for my master's in conducting, and I was feeling very destitute. So I went to HMV in London and bought that box set, and I have never put it away. It all nine symphonies I consider to be real benchmark recordings for me.
And why? Tell us a bit. Now this is interesting. A lot of our subscribers, our patrons, people who follow classical music, know that there are so many different recordings
Oh yes,
of each
so
piece,
right.
but sometimes they don't know to the extent of us musicians collecting or favoring certain recordings. We might have 5 or 6 or 10 recordings of a certain piece. Why is this one with Norrington and the London Chamber Players special to you?
I love his pacing of the
Mm-hmm.
symphony, especially the fifth, the seventh, the eighth, the pacing of his fourth, the overall arc and narrative from start to finish. It just
Mm-hmm.
completes this complete picture in mind, and I find them very no nonsense in
Okay.
terms of their attack.
And
You
what
know,
grabs you about the fifth, especially?
um, I it's the first movement of the fifth for Norrington that wins for me. It has got that snarl. It's got that bite. You know, it has that sort of relentless direction and
Mm-hmm.
purpose that you really need to have. And the first movement, I'll tell you a quick anecdote. Um, when I was a young boy, I had this recurring nightmare about being chased by a tiger.
By a
And I
tiger.
grew up in by a tiger, and I grew up in the country, and we had a lot of property, and it was always in that dream he was chasing me on the property, and no matter where I went, he would find me. No matter how fast I ran, he would find me. I always woke up when he did, but I always link that back to the first movement of Beethoven 5
Hmm.
because it's that relentless, constant driving pace that you can't escape,
Right.
and it's fuel charged. It's this pursuit. There's no letting up. It's pure drama, and
Right.
it's very unfussy, very straightforward, and it's just boom.
I love how
There
you
it is.
say the how it's unfussy. It's
Yeah.
it's we've played this up a bit with the duking it out.
Right.
Martin and I, discussed a little bit before. We actually have favorite recordings we both love, and Norrington is one of my favorite recordings as well. But what I love about it, like you say, is there's really no fuss, and it goes. And for those of you out there who might not know, there are different styles of playing, and Roderick Norrington and some others are of a style called historically informed performance practice, where they'll take tempos and tunings and different phrasings as you might have heard in Beethoven's time. And we'll get into later into maybe another recording or two that do the old school modern approach, if that's not an oxymoron. And so Norrington is one of those HIP, historically informed performance practice conductors, who lays it down and it just goes. But because of that, there's a sweep that and Beethoven 5 is a very compact symphony.
It is, and it's a very fleet-footed, and it moves with such ease at the same time as having all this drama and all this command. It just moves with this flow and ease that I haven't heard in another recording before.
Okay.
And I said to you earlier today, since Eric asked me to do this, because I'm a runner, I decided over the past few weeks to run every day to a different recording of Beethoven 5, just to mess with my head and put other interpretations in there, and just to hear them out. And if I can do 5K within Beethoven 5, I consider that a pretty good run, with all the repeats.
Right.
But it's really interesting to hear. I mean, it's such a wide variety of interpretations, and there's so many different recordings.
Hugely. And it's funny that you mentioned the running, because we are having a Beat Beethoven
I know.
virtual run, of course, coming up, where people get to choose different recordings of Beethoven and try to beat it. But it's perfect that you've actually done it, a Beat Beethoven race, basically. And like you say,
for the past few weeks.
and like you say, there are different recordings that take different repeats and not the repeats, and some maybe bit older school might be a bit longer. So you've got to choose. If you're running, you got to choose accordingly. That's for
Yeah,
sure.
that's right. Yeah.
Good. And what's and by the way, audience members out there, please fill us with questions. Ask us about different things. Just there's one question by Karen Moffat. She says, "Do you have an awesome brother named Dan MacDonald?"
I do indeed have an awesome brother named Dan MacDonald. I do.
Karen asks it because Karen, this is a very nice little connection here. Karen, my wife, personal trains Martin's brother Dan and his wife Jen, who's a tuba player, and over Skype, and they've been doing that for years. And I totally forgot about that connection until this morning. I think you mentioned it, and I thought, of course, you guys are brothers.
Yeah, that's right.
Nice. Okay, what else? What other recording do you love?
So for the middle movements, for the second and third movements, for me, it's David Simmons' recording from Zurich in 1999 with the Tonhalle, and it's what they achieve on this recording in the middle. Well, first of all, it was billed as the world premiere of the Barenreiter edition on modern instruments,
Right.
and it's astounding. There are these spectacular nuances and phrasings and colors that I had never heard before. And as a conductor, we know that every time you pick up a Beethoven symphony, doesn't matter how many times you've done it, you learn something new. And I learned something new just by listening to this particular recording, because there were all these rosewoods and mahoganies and all these deep, dark, beautiful woodwind colors he was pulling out of the voicings, and with all sort of like this splendid, superb precision, and all this nuance. It's really something that the middle movements of his recording. And he does get an honorable mention for the oboe cadenza from the first movement.
Okay. the principal oboist of the Tonhalle.
Yeah, he plays with it, and it's just gorgeous what he does with it. It's absolutely amazing. Yeah.
Well, like you say, this recording is a bit of a benchmark because it was one of the first where an older conductor, as David Zinman, by the way, is an American conductor, now into his 80s, but at the time when he recorded this with the Tonhalle, he was in his 70s, and he was considered kind of the old school type of conductor. He was with Baltimore for many years, and he took a number of years of really diving into the historically performed approach, and he wanted to kind of mesh those two worlds with the modern orchestra. So there's different also pitches. Historically informed performance groups will play probably at about 415 or 430, which is the hertz, and modern orchestras like SSO and others will play at 440. And what Zinman does with the Tonhalle, which is a great modern group, they play at 440, but they have so many Baroque elements, but still on modern instruments. So you have the bows that are modern, you have the strings that are modern. Oboes are not Baroque oboes or classical oboes. You've got all these modern instruments, but they're with a Baroque style. And it's not just Baroque on modern instruments. There's a beautiful, like you say, I love how you used the wood colors, mahogany and rosewood, to really bring out different colors that are unique. It's not just modern orchestra and not just historically informed orchestra. It's a combination of the two. And I think he did a splendid job doing that. Yeah. Look at us. We're agreeing, and we're not even, we're supposed to be duking it out.
This is not a good start. Oh. This is not a good start.
And who else do you have?
I do have a third, and for me, for the last movement, it's John Elliott Gardner, Orchestre Romantique Revolutionnaire. I think it's from the mid-90s, if I'm not mistaken. And for me to sit and listen to a recording that literally lifts you off your seat is quite a thing. I mean, it happens in live performances all the time. That's what we aim to have people do. But to sit and listen to a recording and just be off the edge of your seat. The last movement is just pure joy and excitement. And, this whole symphony is, it's starts in C minor, ends in C major. So it's the battle in C minor and C major. And there are sections within the middle movements that go between. And so this is sort of like this dark to light. And he brings this light with such pure joy and excitement. But he doesn't sacrifice pacing. He doesn't sacrifice nuance. He doesn't sacrifice colors or phrasings. It's just tremendous vitality, this freshness, immediacy, and verve, and it's just and breakneck speed, like
incredible speed. And so this is another thing. I'm glad you brought that up. And by the way, this is probably, if I had to choose one recording, it would be Gardner. So John Elliott Gardner started he's another one of these historically informed performance groups or conductors that uses one of these groups, and he he sticks with the metronome marking. So some of Beethoven's metronome markings are a bit controversial, or they used to be, at any rate, where they're quite quick. And so Gardner and Norrington, they actually use these recordings or metronome markings. Actually, so did Toscanini, old school. But if you listen to his recordings, they're actually exactly, pretty much exactly what Beethoven asked in terms of tempo. But the Gardner, John Elliott Gardner, doesn't mince words. He gets exactly what he wants, and for those of us in the musical world, we hear rumors or know stories or have met these people. And like I said, John Elliott Gardner, he doesn't suffer fools gladly, and what he wants, he kind of gets. And this is so good for a symphony like Beethoven 5, where, like I said before, it's very compact. It's so intense in a short amount of time that he brings us about. I love that you mentioned that it goes from C minor into C major, and this was the first symphony really that transitioned attacca into the fourth movement. And so, which means in the third movement, you're going along and it doesn't stop. There's no break before the fourth movement. And about 30 seconds before the fourth movement, you're still in minor. And all of a sudden he starts playing with the major and boom. And like you say, there's this joyous, resounding thing. And harmonically, it's not that complicated. It's basically straight ahead.
It's a remarkable transition. It's remarkably written, and it was so revolutionary for its time. And also, of course, to use trombones and in the last movement, one of the first symphonies, well, the first symphony, I guess, to do that.
First of his,
and that transition itself is just, that's like, I liken it to like climbing out of a dark well, and you're just coming out towards the light, and then bang, and you have this.
That's right. And he called trombones the voice of God. Actually, at his funeral, there was he wrote a trombone quartet that was performed, and he loved trombones. But you're right. There's special instrumentation and a directness that John Elliott Gardner just lays it down.
Yeah, and especially in that last movement in particular, it's just it's really something.
You mentioned buying the Norrington discs at HMV in London. When this set came out, I have it up on the screen with John Elliott Gardner. It was in '95, I believe, and I was working at HMV in Toronto. So Toronto on Yonge Street used to have this. I don't know if it's still there. Probably not. But they had a 4-floor, 3 floors plus a basement, massive flagship store, and the whole top, or most of the top of the store, was classical. The top floor, there's a little bit of jazz off to a side, but it was. I worked there for about a year and a half, and I remember when this came out, and it was very, very excited because it was kind of the set that went against duking it out with Norrington, and so there's a lot of. Well, at least for us musical geeks, there's a lot of excitement in the air. That's for sure.
Oh, absolutely, for sure. I mean, there are so many good recordings, and so many from the sort of the romanticized, more old-fashioned recordings, and so many from the HIP world. Tafel Music's recording is an excellent recording of Beethoven.
That's right, and those are live recordings. So Tafel Music is Canada's Baroque orchestra, you can say, and or one of them, but definitely the oldest and probably most famous. And they did the whole series with Bruno Weil, and their recordings are live. They recorded them over 3 or 4 nights, and there's an excitement and energy. And I was actually in the hall for a couple of those recorded events, and you can just feel it because it's live, and they're such an exacting group, and you want to get it right. So you're right. There are a lot of great recordings out there, and I want to bring up one that we can duke it out. This one is what we talked about earlier as kind of an old school recording.
Right.
It's also a very famous recording, and it's by Carlos Kleiber, that came out in the mid-'70s. And he, on Deutsche Grammophon, as you can see up there, you can't, Martin, but the others can. Carlos Kleiber was this very eccentric, secretive conductor. During the by the end of his life, he would only conduct 1 or 2 concerts a year, and then he would cancel usually that concert, and his repertoire dwindled and dwindled. But he was very, very well known for doing 4, 5, and 7 of the Beethoven symphonies. And this recording with the Vienna Phil, yes, it's at 440 and it's old school modern, but wow, is it electrifying! And I encourage everyone who is listening to go to the SSO's page, and you'll see on our Spotify playlist, you'll hear a lot of these recordings. Apparently the Zinman isn't there, but the Gardner, the Norrington, and this Carlos Kleiber one is there. Have you ever heard the Kleiber version?
I have. It's actually been a while since I've listened to it, but I after we talked this morning, I had another listen to it because it had been a while. And you're right. It is quite electrifying. I struggle with because I've been so entrenched in sort of like appreciating these no nonsense sort of like boom to the point recordings of Beethoven. It's kind of tricky now to listen to a recording that, where those opening fermatas are just so over dramatized and drawn out, and so. But I do appreciate them for what they are, and I did this ballet a number of years ago where we did Beethoven 7 and 8 for a ballet program. So Beethoven 8 for the first half, Beethoven 7 for the second half, and the choreographer gave me this recording that it was from the 60s of Carry On.
Okay.
And said, "Can you match these tempos?" And so with ballet, you have to sort of right. You have to make some. So I listened to them, and at first I was thinking, I'm not going to like this because Carry On's a little bit old. Is not really too sure in a big orchestra, and there are so many concerns in terms of tempo with big orchestras because the bigger the orchestra, heavier things can get. But I was actually really surprised at how much I appreciated them because you have to remember, you have to appreciate that these are world-class artists. So there is a level of musicianship there that is truly there. So
extraordinary, and they're musicians of their time. And so, you mentioned that Karajan recording in the 60s, and he, in his lifetime, this is Herbert von Karajan, most famous for being the music director of the Berlin Phil for many, many years. He recorded 4 sets over his life, one with Philharmonia Orchestra in London just after the war on EMI, but then 3 subsequent sets in the 60s, 80s, and 90s with Deutsche Grammophon. Or sorry, 60s, 70s, and 80s, because he died in 89.
That's right, 60s, 70s, 80s.
Yeah. But they change. They change immensely. In his Philharmonia days, it was a bit more straightforward and kind of to the point. And by the end, whoa, are we getting into an immensely rich and different sound. But you're right that it's when we are so immersed in a sound, so immersed in a style, for instance, the historically informed performance practice, that most of us who have, in this era, we mostly tend to lean toward that tradition in certain repertoire. It's sometimes hard to put us back in those old recordings, especially recordings when we grew up with. I remember in grade 4, my parents gave me for Christmas a cassette tape, Deutsche Grammophon, a Bernstein with 5 and 7, and I played that thing until it wore out on my Walkman. But when I was a kid, it was the best thing in the world. Now looking back and listening to, it's been a while since I've listened to a Bernstein Beethoven symphony, but I can almost assure you that will not be my go-to fix.
Yeah. I mean, so I keep that in mind, but it's there's such musical depth to those performances, even if I don't agree with the pacing or the phrasings or the tempi. It's a funny thing about, you mentioned before about Beethoven's metronome markings and how they've been controversial or maybe no longer so controversial. when I was in my master's degree at McGill, one of my major research projects was I took the nine symphonies of
Mm-hmm.
Beethoven and I compared recordings of every movement from a number of different conductors. And I did a presentation on it where I was comparing, and some of them were just, like Boom and Celibidache. And I mean, he had a whole different sort of idea,
Right, right.
obviously, but it was just for the fifth, especially, there were some remarkable differences. Some of them were like 20 metronome marks off one another. Just
Exactly.
one. But so that was the first part of the project. Second part of the project was I took um, I took the Italian marking and the metronome marking, the meter, the pulse, the note values, and charted them, and the type of movement itself. And it was incredible how consistent he was.
Mm-hmm.
All his andantes in cut time with a quarter note pulse with this metronome marking were always like within 2 to 4 points of one another. He was
Right.
incredibly precise.
Incredibly.
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, and another thing that we have to keep in mind is these practical considerations as well, like these bigger orchestras like the Berlin Philharmonic and the Vienna Philharmonic, massive string sections.
That's right.
Carry On used quadruple winds, especially for his video recordings. He would double the size of the winds. So the size of the ensemble, the venue, the acoustic, all these have to be taken into consideration when you consider these metronome markings. Like take a look at the first movement of the third.
Yeah.
Roika, I mean, that's dot and a half equals 60, but if the tempo goes all the way around because it's constantly.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
and like you mentioned, back at the time, so Beethoven would often premiere it at Prince, whoever it was,
Right.
in their salon, and it would be at most four to a part in strings,
Exactly.
and the winds are even eight is just double winds,
Mhm.
and in 5 and 9 you have one or two extras and some trombones, but 7 and 8 are a chamber orchestra in terms of just double winds. That means two flutes, two oboes, two clarinets, two bassoons, two horns, two trumpets. And that's actually chamber orchestra. And so, like you say, when these bigger, as the repertoire not only got bigger, but the orchestras themselves got bigger. And I'm glad you mentioned Karajan's videos. So for
Yeah.
those of you who know, Karajan, he worked actually with the head of Sony. He was friends with the head of Sony. Legend has it that the Sony CD length is based on Beethoven 9, that you can fit all of it on one recording. And because he was friends with Sony, he thought, okay, this is the end of my life. I've got to put everything I do on disc for future generations to see. And so these video recordings of them, of the orchestra, not in any normal formation that you'd ever play with, but they're on these slanted amphitheaters, basically, of, like you say, double winds or triple winds, and everything there, and everyone everyone looks a certain way where these people are looking this way. It's very theatric,
Yeah.
but and we look at it now, comical. Well, in a way, it's still some, how do I say it, extraordinary music making in
Yeah.
that style,
Exactly.
for that time in that style. But it's funny how different tastes change, how different styles change over the years.
Yeah, and traditions passed down on what happens in these symphonies and all other pieces of music. How
Yeah.
tradition pass through. I mean, there's lots of examples of that.
So
When
do you have we've got a comment from Sandra. Hi Sandra. My first classical record at about 10 was Seiji Ozawa with Chicago Symphony on RCA, Red Seal.
Mhm.
Nice, nice. That's good. That's yeah, that was back in the day. That was back in the day when Seiji, he hadn't yet got Boston, and he was in Toronto for just a year or so.
Only
Was it
that's it.
1 year?
The end of the '60s. It was
Yeah,
just one.
and then he got Boston almost immediately afterwards, and went down there. But he's still living. He's been sick the last couple of years, but he's still living and still making recordings.
Mhm.
What was Martin? What was from your childhood? Do you remember certain Beethoven recordings or artists that you, or symphonies, or sorry, orchestras or conductors?
Um, I didn't have I don't have a memory of a first Beethoven recording. Uh, my most vivid memory of my first recording that I wore out was a cassette tape of Mahler Symphony Number 2,
Okay.
and I have no idea who the orchestra was or the conductor was.
Okay.
Because my mother, because I was playing the youth orchestra in Nova Scotia at the time.
Yeah.
I was 15, and we were playing Mahler 2. It was a joint concert with the youth orchestra and
Fantastic.
Georg Tintner conducting,
Oh, nice.
which was magical. And my mother found out that we were doing Mahler 2, and she wanted to get me a recording. So she went to see my aunt, who was a nun at the convent in Antigonish, who had a friend that had a bunch of recordings, and she taped it off for me, but forgot to write down who's on. Like,
That's
so
brilliant.
but I wore that tape out. I wore it out backwards and forwards. I must have listened to it 1,000 times. But
I have a feeling at some point in your life, you're going to come across a recording. It's going to be on the radio or something. You're like, that's it. Because it's probably so ingrained in your brain.
Yeah, yeah. But the great thing about Beethoven symphonies is that, all these, I mean, I come from an orchestral playing background, as well as you're a violist and I'm a violist. And so I've played them all. I've conducted many of them. I've studied them all. So they're all just ingrained in us, and there's from so many different angles.
That's right. And they seem to never, at least for me, never tire. I mean, I remember the first time I played one in youth orchestra, I could not believe it. We played Beethoven 7, and I remember turning to my stand partner, and I was baffled. I was like, "What? This is too much!" Like, it was so incredible, and it was a great experience. And that's what I think Beethoven does to so many people.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's that's why he's still alive and well in so many of us.
Exactly.
Music has lived on for so long.
We've got a great question from Cindy. Hi, Cindy. For either of you, speaking as a musician, what was your most memorable or important guest conducting experience?
Oh boy, I need to think about that one. There's been so many good ones. Would you like to start?
What's the top couple? Or
top couple
that you just...
Oof. That's a hard one to rattle off the top of my brain. It has, boy.
Was there a certain, maybe it's even just the connection with the musicians, or a certain piece, or something that just stuck out?
I think in the times I've conducted Beethoven 7, which has been a few times now, Dvorak 8 has been another very, very memorable experience for me. I remember right after I came out of my residency in Nova Scotia, I think it was in the 2011-2012 season. I got called last minute to come conduct the Edmonton Symphony.
Okay.
And it was Dvorak 8. And I only had 2 rehearsals and a dress to do it because it was one of their Sunday series.
Right.
And I remember I just took the plunge and I did Dvorak 8 from memory, and I did it in that amazing hall that they have there, the Winspear Center.
Yes.
And that was thrilling. That was a really thrilling experience just to do it like on the fly.
Yeah.
Do an address, full program, and then just to sort of lift off on that in that hall. That's definitely something that has stood out to me.
Oh, that sounds special. There's something about those last minute things under pressure where you just go and you just like, I hope this works out, and then it's just explosion. Yeah.
Always risky to go conducting from memory. Always risky. The other piece when I was in Hamilton was a performance of, and it was special because of a big mistake that I made.
Oh, okay.
And it was Debussy La Mer.
Yeah.
And it was with the National Academy Orchestra of Canada, which is the training orchestra, professional training. And so we had a number of professionals within, mentors working with the musicians. And I was doing La Mer, and again, doing it from memory. And the last movement, I watched the video afterwards, and I saw that I gave 2 upbeats. It just was instinctive.
Right.
So the orchestra sort of shifted off course for about a measure and a half.
Okay.
And it was thanks to the principal oboe of the TSO, Sarah Jeffrey. She was playing in the orchestra. And she was playing second or third or something, because we would let the students play the
Right,
first part.
right.
She saw the mistake, and she helped me just pull everybody back on. She just something about the way she led, and
Wow.
And then the performance was just magical, just because it was saved, and it was a group effort. It was like just sort of like this.
That's incredible. That's a couple of professionals working together, and we all know Sarah is extraordinary.
Oh, she's
and
extraordinary.
And I'm sure she did it in such a beautiful way, calm way of going, Martin, we've got this. We're gonna go.
And I thanked her so profusely afterwards. And she was like, "You don't need to do that. I just did what I'm supposed to do." So
Sarah's the best. That's great. We've got we're going to wrap things up pretty soon, but Megan actually has a wonderful question that's not often asked. You mentioned earlier that some recordings are more romantic. What are some ways to add romance to something like Beethoven 5? And this is, I want to hear what you want to say, what you have to say, Martin, but this is something I love to discuss, but go ahead.
Add romance to Beethoven 5. I think there's sort of an element of the second movement that, it's in the middle movements, actually. It's in both the middle movements, because there's something special about this reprieve that we have in the second movement. We have this relentless chase in the first movement. The second movement, we're sort of like relaxed for a moment, and there are these beautiful, all these variations,
Mm-hmm.
and there's something really special you can do with the cellos, for instance, and there's so many woodwind conversations that you can sort of just let them speak really freely, yet keeping that sort of insistent tempo that he wants. And then in the third movement, you have all these ideas of all these sort of like, love and life, and sort of like, where do I go to come up to the light? So there's ways to add romance in that drama.
Exactly, and I'm glad you brought that up, because often even in orchestral musicians or musicians, when we think about romance or romantic music, we think of a lot of vibrato and different things, but that actually came a lot later. And that's Beethoven was on that cusp between classical and romantic eras, mm-hmm. and romance or romantic music of that time meant simply showing more feeling, getting into showing more emotion in different ways. And the second movement is definitely that. Even, or maybe because of that quicker tempo, there's an immediacy of those emotions, and it's not drawn out, say like a Bruckner or a Mahler symphony, but it's definitely there in the structure that he provides.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, Martin, this has been a pleasure.
Yes, absolutely.
Like I mentioned before, and the SSO is mentioning on our chat, we've got this music on our Spotify playlist. So I encourage everyone to go there and check out different recordings, compare them, listen to them and say, hey, I really love this. Ooh, I can't stand this. What's wrong with this phrasing? Just get into it and hear what you like and don't. So thank you, Martin. It wasn't, either of us didn't get bloodied or no teeth lost. Thank goodness. But it was a pleasure having you on there. Now, before I say goodbye, I just want to remind everyone that on Thursday, we're back to our Meet the Musicians in Your Neighborhood local edition, where we have 3 members of the percussion section. Darryl Bickert, Fraser Cripps, and Brad Lists are joining us for that half hour. And I'm sure we're going to get up to a lot of shenanigans with those percussion types. They're a lot of fun. So join us Thursday at 7:30. And Martin, once again, thank you very much. And I can't wait to see you in person soon.
We'll see you next season.
All right. Great. Thanks, Martin. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.